Relationship with China, as we've seen over the past number of years, has been not without very real challenges. Canada will never shy away from standing up from our values for ensuring that our laws are respected.
Prime Minister there on the evolving relationship between Ottawa and Beijing. That's from earlier this month. Tension has been building between the two countries over the past few years, from the detention, of course, of the two Michaels to the expulsion of diplomats over allegations of foreign interference and targeting an MP specifically. Navigating all of this takes strategic diplomacy. Jennifer May was named the new ambassador to China in September of 2022. She's the first woman to ever hold a position, and I spoke with her on Friday. Ambassador May, thank you for being here. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, Rosemary.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs, as you well know, has characterized China as an increasingly disruptive global power. I imagine you agree with it, but do you? And then I wonder how challenging that makes your job.
Well, I do very much agree with it. I think what we're seeing is a confident China going out on the global stage and trying to change the rules of the game, and we have to recognize that reality and deal with it as it is. So China is always a challenge. It's big, it's complex, but I don't think it's unexpected.
Just over a month ago, as you know, the Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, expelled a Chinese diplomat here who was accused of targeting Conservative MP Michael Chong. China then retaliated, expelling, I guess, one of your staff members, a consul. Have there been any other consequences to declaring a diplomat a persona non grata, and was that tit for tat to be expected?
That, as far as I can tell, that has been the Chinese response. They've told us that that was the response, that they were acting in a reciprocal way. Yeah. That is, unfortunately, often the way it works out when we have these persona non grata situations, that it is on a one-for-one basis. It's still regrettable, and it still has had a negative impact, and not just on our relationship, but also on the consul, on my colleague and her family, who had to leave on very short notice.
We learned this week that the RCMP are now investigating allegations that China was targeting or trying to intimidate Mr. Chong and his family. How, in your view, should Canada be handling these kinds of campaigns? Because this one is obviously very prominent against Mr. Chong, but there are other Canadian citizens who have said they also have felt threatened by China.
Well, I think it's really important that we do respond. Sometimes it'll be publicly, other times it's not going to be apparent publicly. There's different types of measures different agencies can take. The RCMP investigation is one, diplomatic channels are another, and it's to make sure it's really important that we are taking action, that we are conveying that back to the Chinese, because it's also extremely important that Canadians have trust in their democratic institutions and systems.
And so how do you do that? How do you fit into that then in terms of the diplomatic channels? And do you go knock on someone's door and say this, like, what are you doing? How does that work for you, Ambassador?
So me personally, I go into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and I talk with senior officials there, and I tell them that this is not acceptable behavior, and I point out that all of the things that we need and want to be doing on a more positive basis on the relationship, it makes it very hard to do when foreign interference is at the top of the news cycle all the time, and Canadians are losing trust in that ability to pursue the positive agenda that we also need to be pursuing, whether it's on climate change and environment, which are existential, or whether it's things like trade that are in both of our countries' interests.
How do you pursue those things, both of those things? Because, you know, if the relationship is to some extent based on trust of one another, and China is flouting that relationship, how do you then proceed to try and build on the other fronts that still matter to some extent, particularly on the trade file, I would imagine?
Well, I think what we have to do is make sure that we are taking, we could call it sophisticated, I would call it varied approach, that we don't say, you know, China is only one thing and we can only do one thing with China. It's too big. We have to make sure that we're extending the hand, that we're finding the areas of cooperation where we can and where it makes sense, and that at the same time we have the open and frank dialogue on difficult issues, and that we stand up for ourselves where we have to do that too. And trade has other avenues, there's other dialogues, and so there's different channels that we can use, and it's important that we use all of them and not just the diplomatic, and not just try to characterize and deal with China only in one aspect when it is so much at stake and so many different players and interests.
As you know, the Canadian government has decided to review its ties to the Asian Infrastructure Bank. The Canadian communications director who quit, who you may know, Bob Packard, said that he believes that the bank is dominated by the Communist Party. What are your concerns about Canada's role in that bank, as it was intended to be, I guess, a multilateral institution of some kind, and these are obviously serious concerns that it is perhaps not that?
They are indeed serious concerns, and so that's why the Government of Canada has decided that we're going to suspend our official engagement with the bank at this point. The Department of Finance is going to carry out a very full review and look at all the options, and we'll see where we land at the end of that.
And the fact that Mr. Pickard said that it was the patriotic thing to do as a Canadian to quit that bank, what would be your response to that?
Well, I think those are his personal views, and
Sure.
we are going to be looking at Canadian interests and making sure that our values and our interests are represented in terms of how we proceed in our engagement with the bank or any decision that we take about that engagement.
How do you then deal with the issues around human rights? Obviously, the Uyghurs are sort of the one that first comes to mind for many Canadians. It's certainly what has landed some MPs in trouble with China, because they've made their views very public around the government's treatment of the Uyghur population. How much are you saying to the Chinese government about treatment of the Uyghurs?
I do. I have raised it with them in Beijing. I have colleagues in New York, in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, also in our headquarters in Ottawa. We raise these issues because these are important to Canadians and to Canada, and we need them to know and understand that this has an impact on how Canadians view China and our relationship with China.
Well, that's perhaps a good place to end on in terms of how Canada and Canadians view China. I think it is one of real anxiety right now, given the headlines and the things that we're seeing in the news. Do you still believe that it is important to have a diplomatic presence in China and to keep those channels open, given that there are those concerns here in this country?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have to keep talking, and I think if we only talk to the people with whom we were in full agreement, we'd be having a dialogue with ourselves most of the time. So absolutely, I think we need to just keep on talking.
What do you say to China when it comes to Taiwan? Obviously, that is where some of the concern is focused right now, with increased aggression in the Taiwanese Strait.
So I point out that Canada has interests, economic, people to people. We have a large Taiwanese Canadian population, and that our interest is in maintaining the status quo, not raising tensions, and that we adhere strictly to our one China policy, and that we ask them not to try to act in a way that puts any of that at stake, and that raises the temperature in a very sensitive part of the world.
I understand that your job is to say these things and to try and talk to China. I wonder, Ambassador, how good they are at listening, because I'm not sure any of those messages are getting through.
Well, I think, you keep talking and you try to find and try to, at the same time, to understand. It's, communication's not a one-way street. And I certainly encourage them to listen to us and to other partners, but also we have to listen and engage with them and not just, be on send all the time, too. It's about keeping real communication open.
What's the one thing you think that Canadians should understand about China right now?
I think that the COVID years, the last 3 years, has been significant change in China, and that we've lost a lot of our channels of communication, whether it's business people, whether it's fewer journalists, such as the CBC bureau closure, that there's just a lot less going back and forth, and that means we have to try that much harder to get those communication channels back.
Okay, Ambassador, good to speak with you. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary.